Hello, my name's Patrick Dolan, and we are presenting here in a series of videos a set of thoughts and a set of frames that we use in our work across the country with a group called the Teacher Union Reform Network. And this particular little segment is meant to, in some senses, engage us in what I would describe as a more thoughtful approach to the fundamental question of why we do education at all. Almost all of our discussion these days is at the end point of this work called education, and specifically our work in public education. But back behind all of the questions of whether children are learning, all right, and whether teachers are teaching in a certain kind of a process that we think is valid and reasonable and good professional practice, and whether we can hook those at all someday together, all right, in that fulcrum of the work between the play of curriculum, pedagogy, learning and its measurement, and then linking those things constantly, that's the play of basically the work itself and educational reform in general. But as we say at Turn, and we continually kind of try to make explicit, all right, there needs to be some way to think about not only that work itself and its specifics, but in some senses the context, all right, and the processes that are used in systemic reform, all right, to hold those and to in some senses make them authentic in a process and in a larger system in which there is a good deal of suspicion and a good deal of very, very careful approach to any new idea based on a whole lot of experience that's an appropriate place to be for an adult. All right. So in that whole context, I wanted to step back and say, for a minute or two, it's not bad practice to stop thinking about the how and to push ourselves back to think about what and why we think we're doing with education. And to start at a fundamental level, every human community has obviously been kind of struggling with from the very beginning, all right, how to pass on to their children whatever skills they had acquired, not only in that generation, but in a deep historical sense, so that their children could survive, and so that their children could, in some senses, take it further. That's always, in some senses, the fundamental, seems to me, human context. With that, of course, comes experience, not only that, but a sense of skills and a set of skills, practical skills. But the last piece is, of course, some sort of sense of values, what's important and so forth. And that's always wrapped up in the way that one delivers this from primitive times on. Right? At this beginning of the 21st century, it's probably good to stop again and say, where are we with respect to that? We've addressed the issue of social justice inside public education in a democracy, quite different than the role of education perhaps in a more autocratic society, or one that thinks that public education's job is to sort children early on so they can get on with skill building in different areas. All right. Ours is simply a deep belief that somehow this thing has to do with equality as well. It also has to do, as it always probably does, but we make it quite explicit, it always has to do with the growth of the child. And the last piece is that we certainly, and this is all over against cognitive content and its acquisition, the last piece that balances that circle is in some senses citizenship in a democracy, how to live with one another with respect to differences and how to reach decisions in that very increasingly complex world. That citizenship piece is under enormous duress in the United States in the beginning of the 21st century. Duress in the sense that both extremes, left and right, trust us as public educators, it seems to me, less and less in terms of our ability to carry that, what I used to call civil religion, the beliefs of the society. And so where those are being carried and how much heft we can give to it, all right, is always up for grabs. I want to go even more deeply back up the history of education and ask a fundamental question. What do we think we're doing, and what would the child look like, all right, if this thing was extremely successful? And I want to start with a fable, interestingly enough. It's my favorite one around education. It comes out of Kipling's Just So stories. Kipling wrote a series, as all of us know, and probably have spent half our young parenting years reading with our children, a series of very primitive and beautifully crafted stories. And the one that I'd like to concentrate on just for a moment to frame this question is the one around how the elephant got his trunk. All right? And the reason is that it seems to me it sets up the issue and the question of education, its risks and its rewards in a lovely way. So as I remember the fable starts, elephants had no nose, a very small nose at the beginning of time, elephant time. And there was this little elephant who in some senses, in Kipling's language, had satiable curiosity. He constantly went through the village asking, why does this happen? Why does this happen? Why does this happen? Every time he asked the why question, he received a spanking by somebody in the village, in the elephant village. So his parents would spank him, and then he'd ask somebody else, and that group would spank him. So his life early on was filled with questions and spankings. So that's the context that Kipling uses to set this up. It occurs to him one day that he's very concerned and very interested in what the crocodile has down in the river, the great gray, green, greasy Limpopo River, all right? What he has for lunch. All right? He asks the question, of course, of his parents and receives a quick spanking. He asks it of several of the village elders. Same thing, he gets a spanking. And then he decides that this is old hat, and he ventures out into the surrounding territory, and he goes to a very, very interesting bush, all right? And in that bush is a little bird that seems to have a lot of answers to life. And so he goes to the bird, and he says to the little bird, what does the crocodile eat for lunch? And the little bird responds, well, there's only one way to get that answer. Why don't you go down to the river and ask him? All right? He thinks about that for a while, and he starts towards the river. On the way down to the river, and this is a critical piece, you shouldn't miss this, of course, or it wouldn't be in there if it weren't important, he meets a rocky python. And the python nobody befriends, and nobody treats with respect, and everybody's afraid of it. However, this little elephant has somehow received enough education to know that you treat all your elders, in quotes, as I think Kipling says, with some modicum of respect. So he does. He engages the snake, talks to him politely, and then goes on about his business. Goes down to the river, begins a dialogue with the crocodile about what he has for lunch. The crocodile, of course, invites him in closely so he can hear the questions. All right? At the right moment, the crocodile grabs his nose, all right? And the little elephant struggles for his life. All right? And he would have been lunch for the crocodile and answered the riddle, all right? Except that the rocky python sees his dilemma, comes down to the river, grabs him, all right? And there's a tug of war, of course, all right, that's described brilliantly, and the python and the elephant long-term win. Right? Of course, the repercussion there is that his nose is no longer a short nose. Right? His nose is quite long. And he goes back to the village. Everybody looks at this, but it turns out he can do enormously skilled and thoughtful things with his elongated nose. He can do all sorts of things, get food that's higher in the trees, do all sorts of issues. And all of a sudden, all of the elephants decide that that's what they want in terms of a nose, and the story ends with him ceasing to be a spanked child and so forth. The point of it, I think, for Kipling, he wrote it for his little daughter, he wrote all these stories for his little daughter, is the following. He sets up, I think, both the risks of education and the values of education in a lovely fable. At least that's the way I read that. In the sense that education in that village, the way he says it, without talking about it at all, is to shut up, listen to the village, stop asking questions, and there's a certain kind of punitive surroundings around that, and that gets framed as, in some senses, the basic elephant education. All right? Listen to what you're told, go out and live life. Stop pushing the frontier in any kind of investigative way. This little guy's not built that way, And so he somehow breaks out of this, takes great risks, all right, is extremely creative and lives at the edge, almost loses his life, all right, but comes back to the village with a gift and a kind of a set of advances for the village that never would have happened had he not broken out of that and taken the risks. It seems to me that's the frame I want to set up. And here's, in some senses, the question that I think we ought to constantly ask ourselves. All right? This is always more than an acquisition of what is already known. And I think we all understand that, but the process of basically going through this thing called education over the formative years of one's life can't, in some senses, truncate the piece that we know is the advancement for not just the child, but for the entire village, which is to say it cannot be a process in which creativity, in which old answers say there are no new questions and new answers. That's the danger of it. But it's more radical and profound than that, all right? There is an element always in a society that says what you really want to do in education is to take your children, teach them the basic literacy and so forth. Number two, teach them, if you will, and this is, I had it in quotes, if I could say it, teach them respect for authority. And if they have respect for authority, i.e. the spankings and stopping the questioning, and the basic literacy tools, they will be fine for the service to this community, to this society. Just the opposite is true. So you're trying to do two things at once, and they are a bit of a paradox. You are trying to instill deep responsibility in the child, not just to master, if you will, skills, values, all right, and the historical experience of whatever community she lives in. You are also trying to say your responsibility, and you're trying to build habits in which one is always at the edge of those, reaching out into a learning and an excitement. Now, we have kind of old shibboleths and words and phrases that somehow take care of that, but we pass by it much too quickly. I came up through this society and its educational reform in the 60s, in which there were several very radical kinds of questions around the role of education. Two of which one came out of Brazil, one came out of Mexico, interestingly enough, Paulo Freire and Ivan Illich. And in both cases, they were asking the same question in a very radical way that I think bears some re-listening. If, in some senses, all right, you use what Freire used to call the alphabetation, all right, of the third world to tame it, to, in some senses, teach it just enough literacy and just enough passivity to basically do what it is we need them to do. And I don't just mean this of the third world. In any place where we are using this in some deep, almost unconscious sense, to mute, to deaden, all right, to in some senses blunt the inherent explosion of creativity and desire to push the frontiers of knowledge, even in one's own life. I'm not talking about experimental scientists. I'm talking about the person, the citizen, who knows that their job is twofold: deep loyalty, and one of the pieces of loyalty is to push the society, to push the old rules, to push us in terms of our values. That's a piece that we ought to kind of constantly talk to each other about as a professional, because in some senses we are given that deep responsibility with parents and for the community to lead not just the acquisition of skills, but to not only not put out that fire, but to ignite it. That, in some senses, has tensions in it. And we ought to basically speak to those paradoxes constantly and to constantly listen, all right, not just to how we measure the acquisition of these fundamental skills, but we ought to have some way, because you don't pay attention unless you have a way to measure, think about, talk about. We ought to have some way to think, talk, and discuss with each other constantly, whether that spirit of learning forever, creativity, deep responsibility to question ourselves, our society, and each other around the future and our work together. So education has that lovely paradox, and I just wanted to touch it again, all right, to somehow open that discussion and making it almost part of our ongoing discussion as professionals.